If you want to distill at a code review, what should you look for? I would distill that down to, is there anything that the author did that I would have done differently? And it doesn't mean that you're wrong, and it doesn't mean that they're wrong. Those tend to be the more complex parts of the change, the more interesting parts of the change, and the opportunities for you, the other person, and the code base to grow and improve.
Hey everyone, welcome to another Hatchpad Insight. I'm Lauren Alexander, one of the creators of Hatchpad, the career hub that connects technologists with emerging startups. If it's your first time here, don't forget to hit subscribe for more insights like this one. Today, we're here with Rob Liebowitz, a senior software engineer at Morning Consult, a technology company that delivers intelligent data to power leaders' decisions. If you don't mind just sharing your name and your title, and maybe share a little bit about your career background as an engineer.
Yeah, my name is Robert Liebowitz. I'm a software engineer at Morning Consult. I've been here for almost 3 years now. In the past, I've worked a few different places at Capital One, which is obviously a very large company. I worked at a very small startup before that called the Center for Open Science, which when I joined, it was a grad student's thesis project. And by the time I left, I think there were around 50 employees. So it was a really cool experience to kind of see that range of different things. As far as technology goes, I've most recently been doing a lot of Go. I've done a ton of TypeScript work in the past. I've done Python in the past. I've done my fair bit of Opsy things like Bash and Docker and AWS. So wide range of experiences.
Fantastic. Diving into our conversation around code reviews, just to kick off, could you share a little bit about why this is so important to review code from the development perspective?
There's a lot of reasons why code review ends up being really important. The really common answers you'll get, I think, when you ask engineers why they review code are things like, we want to find bugs, we want to improve code quality. And these are absolutely true. I think doing a code review is a great way to get at those pieces. Other pieces of it, I think, are the components of you want to have multiple people understand every change that goes into the code base. So it's not one person writing something in a silo and then 6 months later after they're gone, somebody else picking it up. There's also the aspect from a teaching and learning experience. You can find things in a code base and say, wow, that's an interesting pattern. I never thought to do it that way before. And that in the code review process is kind of bi-directional, which is cool. So the person reviewing the code is learning from the person who wrote their change, and the person who wrote their change can learn as well from the feedback of the person giving that review.
When you are going to start off reviewing code, where do you begin and what are some things that you initially look for?
When I start reviewing code, I'll generally do a few passes over the whole course of the review. So first, you're looking at the title of the change, the description of the change. Make sure that from a business perspective, from a functionality perspective, you know what to expect even before you're looking at the code itself. The next piece, I like to do a quick scan and really look for what are the big pieces of functionality that are being changed here? Are there any changes to the public interface, to the APIs, to documentation that really would direct why is this code changing and what are the things that drive it? Once you've made your whole way down and get kind of a better understanding of what those pieces are, it's good to do more of a deep dive and say, okay, does the structure of this make sense? Are there any errors in here? Are the abstractions, the mental model, do all of those things line up with the way that I expect them to line up? And if you want to distill at a code review, what should you look for? I would distill that down to, is there anything that the author did that I would have done differently? And it doesn't mean that you're wrong, and it doesn't mean that they're wrong. Those tend to be the more complex parts of the change, the more interesting parts of the change, and the opportunities for you, the other person, and the code base to grow and improve.
And so when you are reviewing somebody else's code, what are some of the best ways to communicate with that person?
There's a lot to take into account when you're communicating with folks during a code review. A big part of it is that to some degree, it is a vulnerable place for a person who's having their code reviewed. So taking extra care to make sure that you're focusing on the code and not the person, using language like, we need to change this instead of you need to change this. That's a big component of it. Another big piece of the whole code review process, especially as you're looking at phrasing, is making sure that your suggestions are actionable and unambiguous. So a really bad code review comment might look like, this doesn't make any sense, or I'm not really sure what's going on from a concurrency perspective here. On the flip side, better comments are more actionable. Hey, the name of this function doesn't seem to match what the function is doing. I'm not sure which of those two things is supposed to be correct here. Or, hey, you're using a map here and this map is being accessed by multiple threads. Maybe we need to protect it with a mutex. So you're starting to focus on the code, and that naturally lends one to being less of a combative way of looking at it, where it's like you're on one side, the other person's on the other, and more of a conversation. But it also really encourages you to be more specific and more detailed and really cover the things that need to be covered.
Great. So then an aspect that I'm sure comes up relatively frequently is that there may be times you're reviewing code when you don't necessarily feel like a subject matter expert. So in that case, what would be some effective ways to still be able to review, provide some helpful feedback in that case?
One of the things I really like to emphasize is that code review is useful at all skill levels for a number of different reasons. Part of it is when you're getting into code review for the first time, especially on things that you have less context about, you have less expertise on, you have less experience with it. The act of just asking questions is so helpful for everyone involved. It helps the author explain themselves. To vocalize the way that something has changed is a valuable exercise from an understanding of the team, but also an understanding of the code. A lot of times when I get a question on a change set that I've produced, it's a signal to me that something is maybe not as clear as I could have made it. There are also a lot of pieces that someone who's newer to code review or less experienced on a particular technology can pick up and still be effective. Things like, is there clear documentation? Is the function length, the complexity of what's going on, something that looks reasonable, that's manageable? Are there test cases for all of the business scenarios you're looking at? And even if you don't quite understand how the implementation works, you can still definitely be valuable by looking at the change from that aspect. The other thing I'd say is always feel free to loop other people into that review process. Just because you're the person tagged on a code change doesn't mean that you have to be the only person who's looking at it. You can work with other people, tag them for a specific question, say, hey, this change looks good to me, but I know Alex over on the DevOps team has a better understanding of what that process looks like. So if we can get their review as well, I'd be a lot more comfortable merging this change in. And when you see those comments from other people, that's a great opportunity to skill up and say, wow, this is something that I should have caught and I didn't. I can take note of that. And next time I can bring that up in the reviews that I'm doing.
That's awesome. So then on the flip side, if someone is reviewing code that you wrote, what would be some tips to being a good reviewee to be able to receive those comments?
Yeah, one of the really big parts that makes a code review successful is the preparation that a person does before the code review begins. So we're talking about things like writing a really descriptive title, making sure that the change set is an appropriate size. What I mean by that is the more code that ends up in a code review, the worse the review is going to be. There's this concept of if you write a single line of code and you submit it for review, people can talk about it for hours. But if you submit 1,000 lines of code all at once, people will just say, yep, looks good to me. And that's not at all what you want, right? You really want to get the most value out of the feedback that you're going to be getting there. So managing the size of that. A lot of teams have definitions of done or checklists of things that they need to do before a merge request or a pull request is ready for review. Making sure you do those. So don't expect people to do a formal code review process if you haven't written your tests and it's a requirement that tests are part of that change. Now, that said, there are ways that you can get feedback that aren't formal code review, and it's totally fine to say, hey, this is a draft. Can you help make sure that I'm in the right direction here, that I'm doing the right things? And it's totally fine to talk with people before that formal review. The other piece that I would say is when you're getting your code reviewed, remember that the person reviewing, their goal is to get to a better code base to make sure that the changes make sense. Try not to be on the defensive. You can write wonderful code. And if there's a suggestion, if there's something that could be done better, that's wonderful too. It's not a slight against you. It's not a slight against the way that you've done things. We're just looking to continuously improve here. And where we can make those changes, we should look for those opportunities. So remember that the reviewer has a different perspective. They might not have all of the context that you have, and take every comment as an opportunity to improve the code. You don't have to agree with everything they say. You don't have to do everything that they say. It's not a dictating relationship, but definitely look for opportunities there and look at it from like a growth perspective.
Fantastic advice. My next question for you is more tied to the size of a team. For those that work with really small engineering teams, their process might look a little different because there are just limited people to work with. But then you've gotten to see a small team that's really grown over the years. And so I'm curious, how can code reviews scale as the team grows?
One of the challenges with scaling is that a lot of times the people who are really good at code review and the people who have a lot of that expertise, and with a scaling percentage of their time being dedicated to code review as the organization grows. And the challenge with that is that as you scale up the amount of work that's being produced, you need to scale up the amount of people who are willing and able to do that. So my biggest advice to any growing organization is try not to have any bottlenecks where we need to have this one person review all changes that come here. The goal should be teach other people the projects that you're working on, the technology that you're working on, get them that expertise so that they're willing to be a subject matter expert in all of the different aspects of where it's going. And then you can better distribute that across the organization. The other piece is skilling people up on code review themselves. If you're writing code, if you're asking for review, you should be spending just as much time giving review, even when you're inexperienced, because as you gain that expertise, you can give back to the organization and keep those ratios healthy.
Are there any final best practices or tips that you would want to share with folks as far as approaching code reviews?
There's some automation you can do before you get to the code review process. Static analysis, code linting. These are really valuable tools that can save a lot of time in the sense of if you get feedback as you're writing your code inside of your editor, as opposed to pushing code off, waiting for another person to get back and say something that you could have had a machine tell you for free. That's the first thing that I look into for optimizing that process. The other piece is for components that aren't automatable, but you still want to standardize on. I always recommend having style guides. If you can end a discussion before it happens, that's such a huge time saver. And it's such an easy way to say, look, this is a question that we've answered. We don't have to spend time on that now. We don't have to bike shed that. In terms of doing the review process itself, be cognizant of how long you're spending. Research has shown that the review effectiveness drops off really significantly once you start to reach that 1 hour mark. If you find that your reviews are taking that long, it's maybe something you want to address a little earlier in the process and say, this change set is too big. Let's break it up into small, more manageable pieces and get those in one at a time, just to optimize from the review process. And that comes with other perks as well. Smaller changes are easier to manage from a Git history perspective. If you want to revert things or if you want to understand why a change was made. So definitely recommend keeping those down. Be willing to have resolutions to things that aren't formal code reviews. If you see a code change coming in and it's riddled with problems, like you would have to leave 50 plus comments just to get it through a round of review, or if it's structurally doing not what you'd expect it to do and want to really address that underlying issue, reaching out to people directly, like everyone in the code review process is talking with them, really getting at the problem rather than having this kind of asynchronous back and forth is probably a better way to go about it. always be looking for ways to optimize away from the number of round trips between the author and the reviewer.